The training mat was still wet with her blood when the first general walked through the door. Then the second. Then the third. By the time the fourth general arrived, Lieutenant Koenig's face had drained of all color. He'd struck her once, a vicious backhand across the face during hand-to-hand combat practice, assuming she was just another recruit he could intimidate into submission. What he didn't know was that Irene Hill wasn't just any soldier. And in less than 10 minutes, his entire career, everything he'd built over 15 years of service, would be reduced to ashes. This is the story of how one moment of violence exposed a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of command, and how a young woman who'd been told she was too soft for military life became the catalyst for the biggest reform in European military history. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Heidelberg Training Facility, casting long shadows across the polished floors where Irene Hill stood adjusting her training gloves. It was 0545 hours, 15 minutes before the scheduled hand-to-hand combat session, but she'd learned months ago that arriving early was the only way to mentally prepare for what was coming. At 22 years old, Irene cut an unusual figure among the predominantly male recruits at the Advanced Tactical Training Center. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun and green eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. Her slight build and delicate features had earned her nothing but dismissal and contempt since her arrival at the facility 6 months earlier. The training center was part of a joint European defense initiative, bringing together military personnel from 12 different nations for elite special operations preparation. Irene had scored in the top 5% of applicants on every written examination, had demonstrated exceptional strategic thinking, and possessed a photographic memory that allowed her to recall mission parameters with perfect accuracy. None of that mattered to Lieutenant Erich Koenig. Koenig was a 15-year veteran of the Austrian Special Forces, a man whose reputation for brutal training methods was legendary throughout European military circles. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, with a barrel chest and arms thick as tree trunks. His face was weathered and scarred from countless deployments, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd seen too much combat to care about niceties like compassion or fairness. He ran the hand-to-hand combat program with an iron fist, literally. His philosophy was simple: if you couldn't handle physical confrontation, you had no business in special operations. And from the moment Irene had entered his program, he'd made it his personal mission to prove she didn't belong. The first few weeks had been subtle. Koenig paired her with the largest, most aggressive male recruits for sparring sessions. He assigned her extra physical training while other recruits rested. He questioned her techniques in front of the entire class, undermining her confidence at every opportunity. When she succeeded despite his efforts, he changed the rules, making the challenges increasingly impossible. But Irene persisted. She studied combat techniques during her off hours, practicing movements until muscle memory took over. She trained her body beyond the program's requirements, building strength and endurance through sheer determination. She documented every session, every unfair assignment, every dismissive comment, keeping detailed records in a journal she kept locked in her quarters. What Koenig didn't know, what no one at the facility knew, was that Irene Hill wasn't just another ambitious recruit trying to prove herself. She was the daughter of General Henrik Hill, a distinguished commander in the Danish military who'd served with NATO forces for 3 decades. But Henrik had made a decision when Irene enlisted: he would not use his influence to smooth her path. If she was going to succeed in the military, it would be on her own merits, without the shadow of nepotism following her career. Irene had agreed to these terms, understanding that anything less would undermine her credibility. She'd changed her contact information in the military database to her mother's civilian details, ensuring that her father's name wouldn't appear in any routine background checks. As far as official records showed, she was the daughter of a schoolteacher from Copenhagen, nothing more. This morning's training session was particularly important. The facility commander, Colonel Weber, would be observing as part of his quarterly evaluation of the program. It was a chance for Irene to demonstrate her capabilities in front of senior leadership, to show that she deserved her place in the program despite Koenig's constant efforts to force her out. She finished her warm-up stretches and moved to the wall-mounted equipment rack, selecting a practice knife for the day's drills. Around her, other recruits began filing into the training hall, their conversations filling the space with nervous energy. Combat training days were always tense, especially under Koenig's instruction. Well, a voice called from across the hall. Little Irene is here early. Trying to get extra practice before you embarrass yourself again? Irene turned to see Private Otto Brandt, one of Koenig's favorites and her most persistent tormentor. He was a massive German recruit who'd made it his hobby to make Irene's life miserable, apparently hoping to curry favor with their instructor. Just preparing for the session, Brandt, Irene replied evenly, refusing to take the bait. Preparation won't help you, Brandt continued, moving closer with a predatory grin. Koenig's got something special planned for today. I heard him talking about it yesterday. He's going to make an example out of someone, and I think we all know who that someone is going to be. Before Irene could respond, the door at the far end of the hall slammed open, and Lieutenant Koenig strode in, his boots echoing against the polished floor. The casual conversation died instantly as recruits scrambled to form ranks. Koenig's presence filled the room like a physical force, his cold gaze sweeping across the assembled soldiers with obvious disdain. Line up, he barked, his accent thick but his English perfectly clear. Today we're working on disarmament techniques. Real combat situations where your opponent has a weapon and you don't. This isn't sport sparring. This is survival. Irene took her place in formation, her heart rate increasing despite her attempts to remain calm. She'd practiced disarmament techniques extensively, knew the theory backwards and forwards, but Koenig had a way of changing scenarios mid-drill, creating situations designed to make people fail. Hill, Koenig called out, his eyes locking onto her with unmistakable intent. Front and center. Irene stepped forward, her movements precise and controlled despite the anxiety building in her chest. Around her, the other recruits shifted uncomfortably, sensing that whatever was about to happen wouldn't be pleasant. Colonel Weber stood near the observation area, clipboard in hand, his expression neutral as he prepared to evaluate the session. Today's demonstration will focus on real-world pressure scenarios, Koenig announced, circling Irene like a predator sizing up prey. In combat, your opponent won't follow rules. They won't give you time to think. They'll use every advantage they have, including size, strength, and aggression. Hill here is going to demonstrate how someone of her diminutive stature handles such situations. The way he said diminutive stature made it clear he meant it as an insult, not a tactical assessment. Several recruits smirked, though others looked uncomfortable with the obvious setup. Koenig moved to the equipment rack and selected a rubber training knife, the kind designed to simulate real weapons without causing serious injury. He tossed it to Brandt, who caught it with a grin that suggested he knew exactly what role he was being asked to play. Brandt, you're the aggressor, Koenig instructed. Full contact. Hill, your objective is to disarm him and neutralize the threat. No rules, no stopping until one of you is incapacitated or submits. This is as close to real combat as we can simulate. Irene's mind raced. Full contact drills were supposed to be supervised with strict safety protocols. This was essentially sanctioning unrestricted violence under the guise of training. She glanced toward Colonel Weber, hoping he might intervene, but he was writing notes on his clipboard, apparently willing to let Koenig run the session however he saw fit. Problem, Hill? Koenig asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. If you're not comfortable with realistic training scenarios, perhaps you should reconsider your career choice. Special operations isn't a place for people who need special treatment. No problem, sir, Irene replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. I'm ready. She moved to the center of the mat, rolling her shoulders and shaking out her hands. Brandt joined her, the training knife held loosely in his right hand, his size advantage obvious as he towered over her. He outweighed her by at least 80 pounds, all of it muscle built through years of intensive training. Begin, Koenig commanded. Brant moved immediately, faster than his size suggested possible. But Irene had studied his fighting style during previous sessions, knew he favored overwhelming force over technique. She sidestepped his initial lunge, using his momentum against him, and delivered a quick strike to his extended arm. The knife clattered to the mat. For a moment, silence filled the hall. Irene had executed the disarmament perfectly, exactly as the manual prescribed. But instead of calling the drill complete, Koenig's voice cut through the air like a whip. Again. Brant, don't let her embarrass you. Use your advantages. They reset. This time, Brant was more cautious, circling with the knife held in a defensive position. Irene watched his footwork, looking for the telltale signs that would indicate his next move. When he struck, it was with more control, trying to trap her against the edge of the mat. But Irene had trained for this scenario. She dropped low, swept his leading leg, and used the moment of imbalance to strip the knife from his grip. Another perfect execution. Around the training hall, several recruits began whispering, impressed despite themselves. Koenig's face darkened. Reset. Brant, stop playing with her. This isn't a ballet recital. The drills continued, each one growing more aggressive. Brant was clearly receiving tacit permission to escalate, his attacks becoming more violent, more reckless. Irene deflected, redirected, and countered, her training and preparation allowing her to stay one step ahead. But she could feel her energy depleting, knew that Koenig was wearing her down through sheer volume of repetition. After the 7th successful disarmament, Koenig called a halt. His face was flushed with anger, his carefully planned humiliation of Irene backfiring spectacularly. Colonel Weber was watching with obvious interest now, his earlier distraction replaced by focused attention. Adequate technique, Koenig said through gritted teeth, but technique isn't everything. Let me demonstrate what happens when you face someone who truly understands combat. He stepped onto the mat himself, and Irene felt her stomach drop. This was a clear violation of training protocols. Instructors weren't supposed to spar with students during evaluation periods, especially not in unregulated full-contact scenarios. Sir, Irene began, the regulations state that. I know what the regulations state, Hill, Koenig interrupted. But regulations are written by people who've never faced real combat. Consider this an advanced lesson in dealing with superior opponents. He picked up the training knife, but there was something different in his stance, something that suggested this wouldn't be a controlled demonstration. The other recruits sensed it too, shifting nervously, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. Sir, Colonel Weber called from the observation area, perhaps we should. With respect, Colonel, Koenig replied, not taking his eyes off Irene, this is my program. I know what these recruits need. The training hall had gone completely silent. Irene stood in the center of the mat, facing an instructor who clearly had no intention of following any rules, under the observation of a colonel who seemed unwilling or unable to assert his authority. She was alone, just as she'd been alone for the past 6 months, forced to prove herself against opponents who refused to acknowledge that she'd already proven everything that mattered. Koenig moved forward, and Irene knew immediately that this was different from the previous drills. His approach was measured, professional, the movement of someone who'd killed with his hands and wouldn't hesitate to demonstrate that capability. The training knife gleamed in the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The attack came without warning, a lightning-fast thrust aimed at Irene's midsection that forced her to twist sharply to avoid contact. Koenig's follow-up was immediate, a series of strikes that pushed her backward across the mat, each movement designed to corner her, to eliminate her options. Irene's training took over, her body responding with techniques she'd practiced thousands of times. She parried, deflected, created distance whenever possible. But Koenig was relentless, his decades of combat experience evident in every calculated movement. He wasn't trying to teach her, he was trying to break her, to force her into a mistake that would justify his months of dismissal and contempt. The other recruits watched in stunned silence. This had gone far beyond training, crossed into something personal and dangerous. But no one moved to intervene, paralyzed by the institutional authority Koenig wielded and the culture of non-interference that permeated military training environments. Irene felt her back hit the edge of the mat. Koenig had successfully cornered her, cutting off her escape routes with practiced efficiency. His eyes held a gleam of triumph as he moved in for what should have been the final disarmament attempt, the moment where she'd be forced to submit or face actual injury. But Irene had one advantage that Koenig had overlooked in his arrogance. She'd studied not just combat techniques, but him specifically. She'd watched him train other recruits for 6 months, had cataloged his patterns, his preferences, his tells. And she knew that his confidence made him predictable at critical moments. As he committed to his final strike, Irene dropped into a crouch lower than he anticipated, swept his leading leg with more force than her size suggested possible, and used his forward momentum to send him tumbling past her. The training knife skittered across the floor as Koenig crashed to the mat, his surprise evident in his face. The training hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Recruits who'd never seen Koenig bested in combat stood frozen, unsure how to process what they'd just witnessed. Colonel Weber's pen had stopped moving, his clipboard forgotten as he stared at the scene before him. Koenig rose slowly, his face transforming from surprise to rage. The professional mask he'd worn throughout the demonstration cracked, revealing something darker underneath. This wasn't about training anymore, it was about ego, about power, about a man who'd built his identity on physical dominance facing the unacceptable reality that a woman half his size had just defeated him in front of his subordinates and commanding officer. "You think you're clever," Koenig hissed, advancing on Irene with none of the measured control he'd shown before. "You think technique matters more than strength? Let me show you what happens in real combat." "Lieutenant Koenig," Colonel Weber called out, his voice carrying a note of warning. "I think we've seen enough demonstration for today." But Koenig wasn't listening. He grabbed Irene's wrist with crushing force, twisting it in a joint lock that made her gasp in pain. "In real combat," he snarled, pulling her closer, "your opponent doesn't care about regulations or fairness." Irene tried to execute a counter technique, but his grip was too strong, his anger giving him strength beyond his normal considerable capability. She could feel bones grinding together in her wrist, knew that he was seconds away from causing serious injury. "Sir, you're hurting her," someone called out, though Irene couldn't identify who through the pain clouding her vision. "That's the point," Koenig replied, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Pain is the best teacher. Maybe now she'll understand that this isn't a career for." His words cut off as Irene, driven by desperation and pain, drove her knee upward into his midsection with every ounce of strength she had left. The blow caught him off guard, making him release her wrist. She stumbled backward, cradling her injured arm, breathing hard. The rage in Koenig's eyes was unmistakable now. He'd crossed a line and knew it, but instead of backing down, he seemed determined to finish what he'd started. He moved forward again, but this time Irene was ready. She sidestepped, used his momentum, and executed a perfect hip throw that sent him crashing to the mat once more. The sound of his body hitting the floor echoed through the silent training hall. For a long moment, Koenig lay on the mat, his chest heaving, his face a mask of humiliation and fury. Every person in the training hall understood they'd just witnessed something that would have consequences far beyond this single session. An instructor had lost control, had allowed personal animosity to override professional judgment, and had been defeated by the very recruit he'd tried to humiliate. Slowly, Koenig rose to his feet. But instead of calling an end to the demonstration, instead of acknowledging what had happened, he did the unthinkable. His hand lashed out faster than anyone could react, a vicious backhand that connected with Irene's face with a crack that seemed to freeze time itself. Irene spun from the impact, blood spraying from her split lip as she crashed to the mat. The training hall erupted in chaos as recruits shouted in protest, some moving forward to intervene. Colonel Weber was already striding toward the mat, his face dark with anger. But Koenig wasn't finished. Consumed by rage at his humiliation, he grabbed Irene by her uniform collar as she tried to rise, pulling her up to deliver another blow. His fist was already drawing back when a voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Lieutenant Koenig, you will step away from that soldier immediately." The voice came from the training hall entrance, carrying such absolute authority that Koenig's hand froze mid-strike. Everyone turned to see a figure in dress uniform standing in the doorway, the insignia of a brigadier general gleaming on his shoulders. But it wasn't just one general. As the first officer strode into the hall, 3 more followed, each wearing the uniform of different European military branches, each carrying the rank and bearing of senior command. The training hall, which moments ago had been filled with shouts and chaos, fell into shocked silence. Koenig's face drained of color as he released Irene, who collapsed back to the mat, blood still flowing from her split lip. The lieutenant stood frozen, his mind clearly racing to understand how 4 generals had appeared within minutes of his assault, as if they'd been waiting for this exact moment. The first general, a tall man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority, moved directly to Irene. He knelt beside her, his stern expression softening slightly as he examined her injuries. "Soldier, are you able to stand?" Irene nodded, though the world was still spinning from the impact. With the general's assistance, she rose to her feet, her hand pressed to her bleeding mouth. Around the training hall, recruits stood in stunned disbelief, unable to process the sudden appearance of such high-ranking officers. "Someone get medical personnel here immediately," the first general commanded, and 2 recruits scrambled to comply. Then he turned his attention to Koenig, and his expression hardened into something that made the lieutenant take an involuntary step backward. "Lieutenant Erich Koenig," the general said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "You are hereby relieved of your duties pending a full investigation into your conduct. You will surrender your training authority to Colonel Weber effective immediately and confine yourself to quarters until formal charges are prepared." "Sir, I can explain," Koenig began, his voice shaking. The recruit was insubordinate. "She." "Silence," the second general interrupted, a woman with short dark hair and eyes that could cut glass. "We've seen quite enough of your explanations. Did you think your actions occurred in a vacuum? That no one was paying attention to how you ran this program?" Koenig's confusion was evident on his face. The third general, a distinguished officer with a French accent, stepped forward holding a tablet. "For the past 3 months, Lieutenant, your training sessions have been under investigation following multiple complaints about your methods. Today's session was being monitored remotely by a review board. Every moment of what just transpired has been recorded." The implications crashed over Koenig like a wave. He'd assaulted a recruit while under active investigation, in front of senior command, with everything documented. His career wasn't just over, it was destroyed so thoroughly that there would be no recovery, no redemption, no second chances. The 4th general, whose uniform indicated Austrian military service, spoke with barely contained disgust. "You have brought shame not only to yourself but to every officer who has tried to maintain professional standards in military training. You will face the full consequences of your actions." Medical personnel arrived and immediately began treating Irene's injuries. As they worked, the first general turned to address the assembled recruits, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command experience. "What you have witnessed today," the first general announced, his voice resonating through the training hall, "is the reason why military discipline exists. Not to suppress soldiers, but to protect them." Lieutenant Koenig forgot that his authority was granted to train and develop soldiers, not to brutalize them. He gestured toward Irene, who was now sitting on a bench while medics tended to her injuries. This soldier demonstrated exceptional skill, composure, and professionalism under circumstances that would have broken many veterans. She defeated a superior opponent through technique and preparation, exactly as she was trained to do. And for that achievement, she was assaulted. The silence in the hall was absolute. Every recruit, every observer, every staff member understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. 4 generals didn't appear simultaneously without reason. This wasn't random, it was orchestrated, planned, the culmination of something that had been building for much longer than this single morning. The female general stepped forward, her bearing commanding attention. "For those of you wondering how we arrived so quickly, let me be clear. We were already on site, conducting an inspection of this facility's training protocols. We received alerts from multiple sources about Lieutenant Koenig's increasingly dangerous training methods. Today's session was monitored from the moment it began. She turned her gaze to Koenig, who stood rigid with fear and dawning comprehension. What you intended as a demonstration of dominance became evidence in your own court-martial. Every illegal strike, every violation of training protocol, every moment of your assault on a subordinate has been documented by 7 different monitoring systems. The French general consulted his tablet before speaking. Lieutenant Koenig, preliminary review indicates violations of at least 17 different military regulations, including assault, abuse of authority, gender discrimination, and creation of a hostile training environment. The final count will likely be much higher once investigators complete their full analysis. Colonel Weber, who'd been standing frozen throughout the general's arrival, finally found his voice. "Sirs, I take full responsibility for not intervening sooner. I should have stopped the demonstration when it became clear that." Colonel Weber, the first general, interrupted, "Not unkindly, you will also be part of this investigation. Your failure to assert command authority and protect a soldier under your supervision will be examined thoroughly. However, your cooperation in providing documentation about Lieutenant Koenig's training methods over the past months has been noted." The implication was clear. Weber had been feeding information to the investigation, likely trying to protect himself while building a case against Koenig. It didn't excuse his failure to intervene today, but it explained how the generals had known exactly when and where to appear. The Austrian general moved to stand directly in front of Koenig, his voice low but audible throughout the hall. 15 years of service, Eric. 15 years of building a reputation, earning respect, rising through the ranks. And you destroyed it all in one moment of ego-driven violence. You will spend the remainder of your career, however brief that may be, understanding that rank carries responsibility, not permission to abuse those beneath you. Koenig's face had gone from white to gray, his hands trembling as the full weight of his situation crashed over him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, apparently realizing that nothing he could say would matter now. The medical team had finished their initial treatment of Irene's injuries. The lead medic, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, approached the generals and saluted. "Sirs, the soldier has a split lip requiring stitches, possible wrist fracture that needs x-rays, and severe bruising to her face and arm. I recommend immediate transport to the base medical facility." "Agreed," the first general said. Then, to everyone's surprise, he addressed Irene directly. "Soldier, before you go to medical, I need to ask if you're able to provide a brief statement about today's events." Irene stood carefully, her face already swelling from the impact. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the pain. "Sir, Lieutenant Koenig has conducted training in violation of safety protocols for the past 6 months. He has shown pattern of targeting specific recruits, myself included, for disproportionate physical challenges. Today's demonstration escalated beyond acceptable training parameters, and when I successfully defended myself using proper technique, he assaulted me." The female general nodded approvingly. "Clear, concise, and professional. That's exactly the kind of soldier we need in special operations. Your written report, which I understand you've been maintaining for several months, will be crucial evidence in the formal proceedings." Irene felt her stomach tighten. Her journal, her careful documentation of every incident, every unfair assignment, every questionable training method. She'd kept those records as protection, never imagining they would become evidence in an investigation of this magnitude. "My journal is in my quarters, ma'am. I can retrieve it once medical clears me." "No need," the French general replied. "Your quarters were secured by military police 20 minutes ago as part of the investigation protocols. Everything you documented will be preserved as evidence. We'll need you to verify the contents, but the chain of custody is already established." The implications were staggering. The investigation hadn't started today, or even this week. It had been ongoing for months, building a case with meticulous care. Irene's documentation had apparently been known to investigators, though how they'd discovered it remained unclear. As if reading her thoughts, the first general explained. 3 months ago, another recruit from this program filed a formal complaint about Lieutenant Koenig's training methods. During that investigation, several soldiers mentioned that you had been keeping detailed records. We obtained proper authorization to monitor your quarters and secured copies of your documentation, which corroborated numerous other complaints. He paused, his expression becoming something close to apologetic. I understand this feels invasive, having your private journals accessed without your knowledge. But your records provided the detailed evidence we needed to build a comprehensive case. Without them, Koenig might have continued his abusive training methods for years. Irene processed this information slowly. Her private thoughts, her careful observations, her documentation of humiliation and discrimination had all been accessed by investigators. Part of her felt violated by the invasion of privacy. But another part, the part that had endured 6 months of systematic dismissal and contempt, felt vindicated. Her suffering had mattered. Her observations had purpose beyond her own protection. I understand, sir, she said quietly. If my records help prevent other soldiers from experiencing what I've endured, then the invasion of privacy is acceptable. The female general smiled slightly, the first warmth any of the senior officers had shown since entering the training hall. That's exactly the attitude that convinced us you belong in special operations, soldier. The ability to put mission success above personal concerns is what separates good soldiers from exceptional ones. Otto Brandt, who'd been standing frozen among the other recruits, suddenly spoke up. Sirs, I need to confess something. Lieutenant Koenig ordered several of us to make Soldier Hill's training more difficult. He told us to target her during exercises, to undermine her confidence. I participated in that harassment, and I accept responsibility for my actions. The admission seemed to break a dam. Other recruits began speaking up, confessing their roles in the systematic targeting of Irene, explaining how Koenig had created a culture where such behavior was not only tolerated but encouraged. The full scope of the toxic training environment began emerging, each testimony adding another layer to the case against the lieutenant. The Austrian general listened to each confession with growing anger. When the statements finally ended, he addressed the assembled recruits with barely controlled fury. Every single one of you who participated in harassment of a fellow soldier will face disciplinary action. Ignorance of regulations is not an excuse. Following unlawful orders is not an excuse. You are trained to think, to question, to understand the difference between legitimate training and abuse. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. However, those who come forward voluntarily and provide full cooperation with the investigation will receive consideration during their disciplinary reviews. Those who attempt to hide their involvement will face the full consequences of their actions. The message was clear: confess everything now, or face worse consequences later. Recruits began glancing at each other nervously, clearly weighing their options. The culture of silence that Koenig had cultivated was crumbling in real time. The medical team indicated they were ready to transport Irene to the base hospital. As they prepared to leave, the first general placed a hand on her shoulder. Soldier, you've shown remarkable courage today, not just in defending yourself, but in maintaining your composure and professionalism under circumstances that would have justified much stronger reactions. That strength of character is noted and will be reflected in your service record. As Irene was escorted from the training hall, she caught a final glimpse of Lieutenant Koenig being taken into custody by military police who'd appeared as if materializing from the walls themselves. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his future reduced to legal proceedings and probable imprisonment. The base hospital was quieter than Irene expected, a stark contrast to the chaos she'd left behind in the training hall. As medical personnel worked on stitching her lip and x-raying her wrist, she found herself replaying the morning's events in her mind, trying to process how a routine training session had exploded into a career-ending incident for her instructor and a multinational investigation. The x-rays revealed a hairline fracture in her wrist, nothing that wouldn't heal with proper immobilization and rest. The doctor, a kind-faced Danish physician named Dr. Anderson, wrapped her arm carefully while explaining the recovery timeline. 6 weeks in a brace, then physical therapy. You were lucky, the fracture is clean. A few millimeters different and you'd have needed surgery. Lucky, Irene repeated, the word tasting bitter. She'd been assaulted by her instructor in front of witnesses and senior command, and the best description anyone could offer was that she'd been lucky. Dr. Anderson seemed to sense her thoughts. I've been working at military facilities for 15 years, and I've treated more training injuries than I care to count. But what happened to you today wasn't a training injury, it was assault. There's a difference, and everyone in the chain of command knows it. Before Irene could respond, there was a knock on the examination room door. Dr. Anderson opened it to reveal the female general from the training hall, now accompanied by a younger officer carrying a secure briefcase. Soldier Hill, the general said, stepping into the room. I'm General Christina Vogel, commander of the Joint European Special Operations Training Initiative. This is Captain Bergstrom, my legal affairs officer. We need to take your formal statement while the events are still fresh in your mind. Dr. Anderson, do you object to us conducting the interview here? Not if Soldier Hill is comfortable with it, the doctor replied, glancing at Irene for confirmation. Irene nodded, though her stomach tightened with anxiety. A formal statement meant this was moving beyond simple disciplinary action into something much more serious. General Vogel sat across from her while Captain Bergstrom prepared recording equipment and documentation. Before we begin, Vogel said, her voice gentler than it had been in the training hall, I want you to understand that you are not being investigated, you are the victim in this situation. Your statement will be used to establish the facts of Lieutenant Koenig's assault and to document the pattern of behavior that led to today's incident. You have the right to legal counsel if you wish, though as the victim rather than the accused, it's not required. I understand, ma'am, Irene replied. I don't need counsel, I just want to tell the truth about what happened. The interview lasted 90 minutes. General Vogel and Captain Bergstrom asked detailed questions about every aspect of the morning's training session, from the initial demonstration through the final assault. They asked about Koenig's demeanor, his words, the reactions of other soldiers, and Colonel Weber's response or lack thereof. But they also asked about the 6 months leading up to today, about the pattern of discrimination and targeted harassment that Irene had documented in her journal. They asked about specific incidents, specific conversations, specific moments when Koenig's behavior had crossed from demanding instruction into abuse. Irene answered every question honestly, her voice steady despite the pain in her face and wrist. She described how Koenig had systematically paired her with the most aggressive recruits, how he'd assigned impossible tasks designed to make her fail, how he'd undermined her achievements and questioned her capabilities at every opportunity. Why didn't you file a formal complaint? Captain Bergstrom asked, his pen poised over his notepad. Irene had anticipated this question, had asked it of herself countless times over the past months. Because I knew what would happen, sir. I'd be labeled as someone who couldn't handle the pressure, someone who was looking for special treatment. Koenig would deny everything, other recruits would either stay silent or support him, and I'd be transferred out of the program with a mark on my record that would follow me for my entire career. General Vogel leaned forward, her expression serious. And that's precisely why systemic reform is necessary. Soldiers shouldn't have to choose between reporting abuse and protecting their careers. The fact that you felt unable to use the official complaint system indicates a failure at multiple levels of command. She paused, then added something that surprised Irene. You should also know that you weren't the only one being targeted. Over the past 3 months, we've documented complaints from 7 different recruits about Lieutenant Koenig's training methods. 3 of them washed out of the program specifically because of his harassment. Your case is simply the most egregious and the most thoroughly documented. The revelation that other soldiers had suffered under Koenig's command hit Irene harder than she'd expected. She'd spent 6 months feeling isolated, believing she was uniquely unable to handle the pressure of special operations training. Now she understood that the problem had never been her inadequacy but rather an instructor who'd corrupted the entire program with his toxic leadership. The 3 who washed out, Irene asked quietly, what happened to them? Captain Bergstrom consulted his notes. 2 were reassigned to standard infantry units with notes in their files indicating they weren't suitable for special operations. The 3rd left military service entirely, citing personal reasons. None of them filed formal complaints because, like you, they feared retaliation and career damage. The waste of it all made Irene angry. 3 soldiers, potentially excellent operators, driven out of service or sidelined in their careers because one instructor had been allowed to abuse his authority without consequences. How many more would have followed if today's incident hadn't forced the investigation into the open? General Vogel seemed to read her thoughts. This is why your documentation was so crucial, Soldier Hill. The other complaints were verbal, anecdotal, easy to dismiss as personality conflicts or soldiers who couldn't handle demanding training. But you provided dates, times, specific incidents, witness names. You built a case without even knowing you were building one. I just wanted to protect myself, ma'am, Irene replied. I thought if things got worse, if Koenig tried to force me out completely, I'd at least have evidence that his treatment of me was discriminatory rather than justified. And that instinct to document, to prepare, to build evidence-based arguments is exactly what makes you suitable for intelligence operations, Vogel said. Which brings me to the real reason I wanted to speak with you privately. She nodded to Captain Bergstrom, who produced a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the examination table. Vogel opened it to reveal what appeared to be a personnel file, though most of the information was redacted. When we began investigating Lieutenant Koenig 3 months ago, Vogel explained, we conducted thorough background checks on all personnel involved, including you. Standard procedure, nothing personal. What we discovered was that your personnel file contained some interesting inconsistencies. Irene's stomach dropped. They'd found out about her father. The carefully maintained separation she tried to preserve was about to collapse. Your emergency contact information listed a civilian, your mother, a schoolteacher in Copenhagen, Vogel continued. But deeper investigation revealed that your father is General Henrik Hill of the Danish military, currently serving as Deputy Commander of NATO operations in the Baltic region. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Irene waited for the judgment, for the suggestion that she'd used her father's influence despite her attempts to avoid it, for the implication that her success was due to connections rather than merit. But Vogel's next words surprised her. We also discovered communications between your father and this command dating back to your enrollment in the program. He specifically requested that his relationship to you be kept confidential and that you receive absolutely no preferential treatment. In fact, he asked that evaluators be particularly rigorous in their assessment of your capabilities to ensure that you earned your place legitimately. Irene blinked in surprise. I didn't know he'd done that, ma'am. We agreed when I enlisted that he wouldn't use his influence, but I didn't know he'd actively requested additional scrutiny. He wanted you to succeed or fail on your own merits, Vogel said. An admirable goal, though it put you in a difficult position. You were held to higher standards than other recruits while simultaneously dealing with an instructor who was actively trying to force you out of the program. Captain Bergstrom added, when Lieutenant Koenig's assault occurred this morning, your father was immediately notified as per protocol for any serious incident involving the child of senior command. He was watching the live feed from the training hall within minutes. Seeing his daughter assaulted while he was unable to intervene was, by all accounts, extraordinarily difficult for him. The image of her father watching helplessly as Koenig struck her made Irene's chest tighten. They'd been estranged not emotionally but practically, maintaining distance to preserve her independence and credibility. Now that distance had forced him to witness her assault without being able to protect her. Is he here? Irene asked. Does he want to see me? Vogel shook her head. He's participating in the investigation from his NATO headquarters, providing testimony about his communications with this command and his requests regarding your training. But he specifically asked that we convey a message to you. She pulled out a handwritten note and read it aloud. Tell Irene that I'm proud of how she handled herself today and every day since she joined the program. Tell her that she's proven everything she needed to prove, not to me, but to herself. And tell her that when she's ready, I'd like to have a conversation about what comes next, as her father, not as a general. Irene felt tears threatening for the first time since the assault. Throughout the chaos and violence and institutional confrontation, she'd maintained her composure. But her father's words, conveyed through military channels because direct contact might compromise the investigation, finally cracked her carefully maintained emotional control. Dr. Anderson, who'd been quietly observing from the corner of the examination room, stepped forward with a box of tissues. "It's all right to feel overwhelmed, Soldier Hill. You've been through a traumatic experience, and adrenaline can only sustain you for so long before the emotional impact catches up." Irene accepted the tissues gratefully, wiping her eyes while trying to regain her composure. General Vogel waited patiently, showing none of the impatience or dismissal that Irene had grown accustomed to from military leadership. "There's another matter we need to discuss," Vogel said once Irene had collected herself. "Lieutenant Koenig's assault on you was the catalyst that brought this investigation into the open, but the scope of the issues we've uncovered extends far beyond one instructor's misconduct. We've identified systemic problems in how this facility handles complaints, supervises training, and responds to allegations of abuse." She gestured to Captain Bergstrom, who produced another document from his briefcase. Colonel Weber's failure to intervene during today's session was not an isolated incident. We've documented at least 12 occasions over the past year when he was informed about concerning training practices and failed to take appropriate action. He prioritized unit cohesion and operational readiness over soldier welfare, creating an environment where abuse could flourish. "What happens to Colonel Weber?" Irene asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be simple. "He's being relieved of command pending investigation," Vogel replied. "His cooperation in providing evidence against Lieutenant Koenig will be considered, but it doesn't excuse his failures as a commanding officer. Soldiers under his command were harmed because he didn't exercise proper oversight." Captain Bergstrom continued, "The investigation has also revealed issues with the Joint Training Initiative's complaint procedures. The system was designed more to protect the institution than to protect individual soldiers. Multiple recruits reported feeling unable to use official channels because they feared retaliation or career damage." Irene nodded, recognizing her own experience in his description. The theoretical protections for soldiers reporting abuse meant nothing when the practical reality was that complaints destroy careers while perpetrators continued with minimal consequences. "Which is why," General Vogel said, "we're implementing comprehensive reforms to the entire European Special Operations Training Program. New complaint procedures with independent oversight, mandatory reporting requirements for training injuries and incidents, regular psychological evaluations for both instructors and recruits, and most importantly, consequences for commanders who fail to maintain proper training environments." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "These reforms will take months to fully implement, but they begin immediately. And they begin with ensuring that what happened to you never happens to another soldier in this program." The weight of that responsibility settled on Irene's shoulders. Her assault, her documentation, her willingness to endure months of abuse while carefully recording every incident, had become the foundation for institutional change. It was vindicating and exhausting in equal measure. "There's one more thing," Vogel added, her tone shifting to something almost cautious. "Your performance in the training program prior to today's incident was exceptional. You scored in the top 5% on every evaluation, demonstrated superior tactical thinking, and showed remarkable resilience under pressure. The only thing preventing your advancement was Lieutenant Koenig's discrimination." Irene waited, sensing there was more coming. "With Koenig removed in the training program under new leadership, you're being offered the opportunity to complete your Special Operations certification. But given what you've experienced, we'd understand if you wanted to transfer to a different program or even request reassignment to a unit that doesn't require this level of intensive training." The choice was being laid out clearly: continue in a program that had traumatized her, or walk away with full understanding and no judgment. 6 months ago, even 6 hours ago, Irene would have known her answer immediately. But now, with her face swollen and her wrist fractured, with the memory of Koenig's assault still fresh, the decision felt more complicated. "Can I have time to think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Vogel replied. "Take a week to recover physically and emotionally." Talk to counselors, talk to your father, talk to anyone whose opinion you value. This is your career, your choice. No one will pressure you either way. As the general and captain prepared to leave, Vogel turned back with one final comment. For what it's worth, Soldier Hill, I hope you choose to continue. The military needs people like you, people who refuse to accept that abuse is just part of training, people who document and prepare and persist despite institutional resistance. But more importantly, I hope you choose whatever path allows you to be the soldier you want to be, not the soldier others expect you to be. After they left, Dr. Anderson approached with discharge papers and prescriptions for pain management. You'll need to stay on base for the next few days for follow-up examinations and to be available for investigation interviews. I'm assigning you to a recovery ward room rather than sending you back to standard quarters. The recovery ward was quiet, populated mostly by soldiers recuperating from training injuries or minor surgical procedures. Irene was given a private room at the end of the hall, partially for security reasons related to the ongoing investigation, but also to provide her with space to process everything that had happened. She spent the first evening staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the day's events in an endless loop. The assault itself, brutal and shocking. The arrival of 4 generals, perfectly timed as if they'd been waiting in the wings. The revelation about her father's involvement and his pride in her performance. The offer to continue or leave the program, presented as a genuine choice rather than a test of commitment. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by pain from her injuries and by dreams that mixed memories of Koenig's violence with anxiety about decisions still to be made. When morning finally arrived, Irene felt exhausted despite having spent 12 hours in bed. Dr. Anderson checked on her during morning rounds, examining her stitches and assessing her pain levels. Physically, you're healing as expected. Emotionally, I'm more concerned. Have you considered speaking with one of our counselors? What you experienced was traumatic, and processing it with a professional can be helpful. Irene agreed, recognizing that her reluctance to appear weak or vulnerable was exactly the kind of thinking that had allowed Koenig's abusive training environment to flourish. Strength wasn't refusing help, it was knowing when to accept it. The counselor, a Norwegian psychologist named Dr. Eriksson, arrived that afternoon. She was younger than Irene expected, probably in her early 30s, with an easy manner that put Irene somewhat at ease despite her general distrust of mental health evaluations in military contexts. I'm not here to evaluate your fitness for duty, Dr. Eriksson explained, settling into a chair beside Irene's bed. My assessment won't be part of your service record unless you specifically request it. This is about helping you process what happened and providing tools for managing the emotional aftermath. They talked for over an hour. Irene described the assault, the months of harassment leading up to it, her feelings of isolation and inadequacy, and her current confusion about whether to continue in the Special Operations Program. Dr. Eriksson listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions but never pushing Irene toward any particular conclusion. Trauma affects people differently, the psychologist explained. Some soldiers want to immediately return to the situation that traumatized them, to prove they're not beaten. Others need distance and time before they can even consider returning. Neither response is wrong, they're just different ways of processing difficult experiences. Which am I? Irene asked. Dr. Eriksson smiled slightly. You're someone who's trying to make a logical decision about an inherently emotional situation. You're analyzing the choice like it's a tactical problem with an optimal solution. But the truth is, there's no objective right answer. There's only what feels right for you, and that might take time to discover. That evening, Irene received her first visitor from outside the medical staff. Rachel entered hesitantly, carrying a small bag of items from Irene's quarters. Rachel was a fellow recruit from Belgium, one of only 3 other women in the Special Operations Program, and someone Irene had considered a friend before the assault. I'm sorry I didn't visit sooner, Rachel said, sitting on the edge of the bed. The entire base has been chaos. Investigators everywhere, interviews with every recruit who served under Koenig, rumors flying about what really happened in that training hall. What are people saying? Irene asked, curious despite herself about how her assault was being discussed among the rank-and-file soldiers. Rachel hesitated, then decided on honesty. Mixed things. Some are calling you a hero for standing up to Koenig. Others are saying you provoked him, that you pushed too hard and got what you should have expected. A few, mostly Koenig's favorites, are claiming the whole thing is being blown out of proportion. The revelation that some soldiers blamed her for her own assault stung, though Irene recognized it was a predictable response. Acknowledging that Koenig had been systematically abusive required other soldiers to confront their own complicity in that abuse, either through active participation or passive acceptance. Blaming the victim was easier than accepting institutional responsibility. What do you think? Irene asked Rachel directly. I think Koenig was a sadistic bully who abused his authority, Rachel replied firmly. I think he targeted you specifically because you were talented and female, and he couldn't stand either of those things. And I think what happened to you could have happened to any of us if we'd pushed back against his harassment the way you did. She paused, then added quietly, I also think I should have supported you more during the past 6 months. I saw how Koenig treated you, heard the comments from other recruits, and I stayed silent because speaking up might have made me his next target. I'm ashamed of that cowardice. Irene reached out and squeezed Rachel's hand with her uninjured arm. You're not responsible for Koenig's actions or for protecting me from them. The system should have protected both of us, all of us. That's what General Vogel's reforms are supposed to address. Over the next several days, Irene's room became a revolving door of investigators, medical personnel, and senior officers. Each wanted her statement, her perspective, her assessment of what had happened and what should happen next. The repetition was exhausting, but she understood its necessity. A case of this magnitude required thoroughness, required multiple corroborating accounts, required evidence so comprehensive that no appeal or challenge could undermine it. Captain Bergstrom visited on the 4th day with an update on the investigation's progress. Lieutenant Koenig has been formally charged with assault, abuse of authority, gender discrimination, and violation of training protocols. Additional charges are being considered related to his treatment of other recruits. He's been removed from base and is confined to military detention pending court-martial. How is he responding? Irene asked, unsure why she cared about the mental state of the man who'd assaulted her. Denial, mostly, Bergstrom replied. He claims he was conducting legitimate training and that you overreacted to standard pressure techniques. His defense attorney is arguing that special operations training requires pushing boundaries and that what happened was an unfortunate accident rather than intentional assault. Irene felt anger rising in her chest. An accident? He backhanded me across the face deliberately. There were 40 witnesses. And all 40 will testify to that, Bergstrom assured her. His defense is weak and becoming weaker as more evidence emerges. We've discovered that he had similar incidents at 2 previous postings, though those were resolved through administrative action rather than formal charges. The pattern of behavior is undeniable. The revelation that Koenig had a history of abuse made Irene's anger transform into something colder and more determined. He'd been allowed to continue his career despite previous incidents, transferred between units rather than being held accountable, permitted to traumatize multiple generations of soldiers because institutions prioritized protecting their own over protecting victims. What about Colonel Weber? She asked. Being relieved of command and reassigned to an administrative position pending retirement, Bergstrom said. He's avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully with the investigation, but his career is effectively over. The consensus is that while he didn't actively participate in Koenig's abuse, his failure to stop it makes him complicit. On the 6th day, Irene was cleared to leave the medical ward. Her wrist was healing well, the stitches in her lip had been removed, and the swelling in her face had subsided enough that she looked mostly normal. Dr. Anderson provided final instructions about physical therapy and follow-up appointments, then added something more personal. I've treated a lot of assault victims over my career, military and civilian. What distinguishes survivors from victims isn't the absence of trauma, it's the willingness to move forward despite it. You've shown that willingness throughout your recovery. Whatever you decide about continuing in the program, trust that you have the strength to succeed. Irene returned to her quarters to find that her room had been cleaned and organized, her personal effects arranged neatly on shelves and desk. Rachel had left a note explaining that she and several other recruits had taken care of things while Irene was in medical care, a small gesture of solidarity that meant more than they probably realized. The journal that had served as evidence was still with investigators, but Irene didn't miss it. Those pages had served their purpose, documenting abuse and providing the foundation for institutional change. She didn't need to keep revisiting those memories, didn't need to carry that documentation forward into whatever came next. She had 24 hours before she needed to give General Vogel her decision about continuing in the Special Operations Program. 24 hours to decide whether she would let Koenig's assault define her military career or whether she would push past it and prove that her place in Special Operations was earned through capability rather than granted through sympathy. That evening, Irene received a secure video call from her father. General Heinrich Hill appeared on her laptop screen, his familiar face showing the strain of the past week. They'd communicated through official channels and written messages, but this was their first direct conversation since the assault. "Irene," he said simply, and the concern in his voice threatened to break through her carefully maintained composure. "I'm okay, Dad," she replied, using the informal address that felt right despite the military context. Physically healed, emotionally processing, trying to decide what comes next. They talked for nearly an hour, not as general and soldier but as father and daughter. Henrik explained his decision to request additional scrutiny of her performance, motivated by a desire to protect her from accusations of nepotism rather than by doubt about her capabilities. He described watching the live feed from the training hall, seeing Koenig assault her while being unable to intervene, feeling helpless in a way that combat had never made him feel. "What do you think I should do?" Irene finally asked. "About continuing in the program?" Henrik was quiet for a moment before responding. "I think you should do whatever allows you to look at yourself in the mirror without regret. If you walk away from Special Operations, no one who matters will think less of you. You've already proven everything you needed to prove. But if you stay, if you complete the program, you'll spend the rest of your career knowing that nothing, not discrimination, not abuse, not physical assault, could make you quit something you wanted to achieve." The morning Irene returned to the training facility, the atmosphere was completely different from her last visit. New leadership had been installed, fresh protocols implemented, and the toxic culture that Koenig had cultivated was being systematically dismantled. She walked through the main entrance with her wrists still braced, her face still showing faint bruising, and her resolve stronger than it had been in months. General Vogel met her in the administrative office, accompanied by the new training director, Major Lindholm, a Swedish officer with a reputation for demanding but fair instruction. "Soldier Hill," Vogel greeted her formally. "Have you made your decision about continuing in the program?" "Yes, ma'am," Irene replied, standing at attention despite the informal setting. "I want to complete my Special Operations certification. I didn't come this far to let one abusive instructor determine my career path." Vogel smiled, genuine warmth replacing her usual professional reserve. "I was hoping you'd say that. Major Lindholm has been briefed on your situation and your performance record. He's prepared to integrate you into the revised training program with appropriate accommodations for your wrist injury." Major Lindholm stepped forward, his bearing relaxed but professional. "Soldier Hill, I've reviewed your performance evaluations and observed recordings of your training sessions. Your technical proficiency is excellent, your tactical thinking is sophisticated, and your resilience under pressure is remarkable. I'm looking forward to seeing what you can accomplish in an environment that values those qualities rather than punishing them." The contrast with Koenig's approach was stark and intentional. Where Koenig had tried to break soldiers down through intimidation and abuse, Lindholm's philosophy centered on building them up through challenge and support. It was the difference between training that served the ego of the instructor and training that served the development of the soldier. Over the following months, Irene completed her Special Operations certification with distinction. The new training program maintained its demanding standards but eliminated the arbitrary cruelty and discrimination that had characterized Koenig's methods. She worked alongside Rachel and other recruits who'd survived the old regime, all of them benefiting from the reforms that her assault had catalyzed. Lieutenant Koenig's court-martial concluded with a guilty verdict on all charges. He was sentenced to 4 years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, and forfeiture of all military benefits. The verdict sent a clear message throughout European military circles that abuse of authority would no longer be tolerated or quietly transferred between units. Colonel Weber retired quietly, his career ending not with celebration but with the knowledge that his failure to protect soldiers under his command had enabled systemic abuse. His cooperation with investigators prevented criminal charges, but his reputation was permanently damaged. The reforms that General Vogel implemented became a model for military training programs across multiple nations. Independent oversight of training sessions, mandatory reporting of injuries and incidents, psychological support integrated into program design rather than treated as an afterthought, and most importantly, consequences for commanders who created or tolerated abusive environments. Irene's journal, once her private documentation of abuse, was published in redacted form as a case study in military ethics courses. Future officers read her careful observations and learned about the importance of institutional accountability, about the difference between demanding training and abusive training, about the courage required to document injustice even when official channels seemed closed. On graduation day, Irene stood among her fellow special operations candidates, all of them wearing the insignia they'd earned through months of intense preparation. General Vogel presented the certifications personally, and when she reached Irene, she paused before handing over the official documentation. "Soldier Hill," Vogel said, her voice carrying to the assembled audience of military leadership and fellow soldiers, "Your journey through this program has been marked by extraordinary challenge and extraordinary achievement. You faced institutional resistance, systematic discrimination, and physical assault, yet you persisted. You documented abuse when speaking out seemed impossible, you maintained professionalism when others abandoned it, and you chose to continue when walking away would have been completely justified." She handed Irene the certification, then added something that wasn't part of the formal ceremony. "More importantly, your courage in confronting abuse and your willingness to push for institutional change has made this program better for every soldier who will follow. That legacy matters more than any individual achievement." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Irene looked out at the audience and saw her father in dress uniform, sitting beside other NATO commanders, his pride evident despite his professional composure. She saw Rachel and other recruits who'd supported her through recovery. She saw investigators and reformers who'd used her documentation to build cases and change policies. But mostly, she saw the future recruits who would enter this program without facing the abuse she'd endured, who would be judged on capability rather than gender, who would train in an environment that challenged them without destroying them. Irene looked at this young recruit, seeing herself 6 months earlier, full of determination but uncertain whether the institution would ever truly accept her. "You'll do great," she said simply. "And if anyone tells you you're not strong enough or tough enough or good enough, remember that those limitations are in their imagination, not your reality. Prove them wrong, just like I did." The girl smiled, saluted awkwardly, and walked away with renewed confidence. Irene watched her go, understanding that this, more than any certification or commendation, was the true measure of success. She'd changed not just her own trajectory but the trajectories of countless soldiers who would follow, who would train in an environment that valued them rather than diminished them. General Heinrich Hill approached as the crowd dispersed, his formal demeanor softening as they moved to a quiet corner of the ceremony grounds. "I'm proud of you, Irene," he said simply. "Not just for completing the program, but for how you completed it. With integrity, with courage, with determination to make things better rather than just to survive them." "I learned from the best," Irene replied, embracing her father for the first time in months. As the sun set over the training facility, casting long shadows across the grounds where she'd been assaulted and where she'd ultimately triumphed, Irene reflected on everything that had changed. One moment of violence had exposed systemic abuse, four generals had shattered a career built on intimidation, and institutional reforms had emerged from one soldier's refusal to accept that abuse was just part of training. She'd been struck during practice, But within minutes, everything had changed. Not just for her, but for every soldier who would train in environments that valued strength without requiring them to endure abuse, that challenged capabilities without crushing spirits, that recognized that true military excellence came from building soldiers up rather than tearing them down. Lieutenant Koenig had tried to break her, to prove that she didn't belong in special operations. Instead, he'd proven that she belonged exactly where she was, and that the military needed more soldiers like her, soldiers who refused to accept that discrimination and abuse were the price of excellence. As she walked away from the ceremony, her special operations certification in hand and her future wide open before her, Irene Hill smiled. She'd survived the assault, completed the program, and changed an institution. Not bad for someone they tried to force out for being too small, too weak, too female to matter. The story was over, but the impact would continue for years to come, in every training session conducted with respect rather than abuse, in every soldier protected by reforms built on her documentation, in every career that flourished because someone had the courage to say that abuse was never acceptable, no matter how it was justified. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.